It's with great pleasure I open this webinar, A Spoonful of Hope, and introduce our two presenters, allied health professionals Bev Sher and Bev Kadish. Bev Sher is a speech and language pathologist and a qualified drama teacher who for more than 20 years has worked extensively with preschool and primary school children, adolescents and adults. Bev enjoys supporting students with language-based learning difficulties, as well as those with autism spectrum disorders to cope in a mainstream educational setting. Bev Kadish is an occupational therapist. Bev specialised in sensory integration and neurodevelopmental therapy and has more than 25 years experience. Bev's special interests include sensory processing disorders and school readiness. Both Bevs are committed to supporting Fragile X families in particular. They both work in their professional capacity as members of the Fragile X Alliance clinic team in Victoria, as well as their own private practices. I'll now hand over to both Bevs to begin their presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Liz, and welcome to everybody. It really is our joy to be here. And thank you to the Fragile X Association of Australia for inviting us for this second webinar in the series that's been presented. I'm going to start off tonight by acknowledging that we realise we have a very mixed audience with both children as well as adults who have Fragile X syndrome. And something that was very useful for me in understanding this is the concept of a chronological age, which is the actual number of years and months, how old you are, versus what we call a developmental age. So I'm just going to share a slide with you. So if we have a look here, at the top, we've got chronological age versus developmental age, and that includes things like cognitive, so that is more learning, emotional, and social interaction. So if we look at the gentleman on the left here, his chronological age is probably early 30s, but that doesn't mean that the strategies and the approach to therapy and the skill level is that of a 30-year-old or even a 25-year-old. He's probably functioning, or should I say possibly functioning, more at the level of this young man on the right, whose chronological age is 4 years. Okay, so tonight we were asked, well, will we be targeting this at kids or at adults? Because some parents are parents of adults, others are parents of young kids. We wanted to remember that regardless of what the individual's chronological age is, we need to have a look at their developmental age and realize that the intervention, the strategies, and the interests might be vastly different from their chronological age. Having said that, though, my rule of thumb is to always treat the individual, regardless of their chronological age or their developmental age, with respect. And that I use as my guiding principle. As long as your intervention towards them is respectful. We have had adults in the past who've said, I'm not looking at these pictures, these are for kids. Whereas we've had others who, the minute you bring something animated out that you think would only appeal to a much younger person, their face lights up because that's their high area of interest, or it's just targeting them correctly at their developmental age. So I hope that's clear. Next slide is just an overview for the evening of what Bev and I will be covering. And you may think, well, why have I used a rainbow icon, or why have I done this in rainbow colors? It's not just to make it look pretty. The reason I did this is Bev and I like to practice what we preach. And some of the strategies and techniques that you'll hear about tonight are the idea of keeping things visual. So if I've got 7 things to get through, I like using the idea of the rainbow colors. So the individual knows what's coming next, and the idea of that there's an end to this task, because that can be really helpful to decrease anxiety when they can see the size of the whole task. Bev and I will interject all the time with one another. She may mention something, I may jump in with an extra example, because really what we want to share with you all tonight is how much progress, how many miracles we've seen from working in this population, and how much hope there really is, we realize how devastating receiving a diagnosis like this can be. But we're coming from it from a totally different side, that we've had, well, for myself, over 24 years now being involved in Fragile X syndrome, and Bev's not far behind that, and the incredible achievements and growth that with some good strategies put in place, we've been able to see and witness and be a part of, which has been a real privilege. So we're going to go through some of our favorites tonight that have helped these individuals do as well as they've done, so that you're all leaving here tonight with some hope too. So Bev, if you'd like to start the first one, and then I'll take over from there, and we'll keep just having some turns so people have something different to look at.
Great, thanks so much, Bev. As Bev said, we work as a team, and I am just going to follow on right with that visual in mind of that rainbow, and say that the most important thing that we can do for our Fragile X individuals is use visuals. They are visual learners. We don't want to bombard them with too much jargon and too much talking. And the first then approach is a very effective thing to do just that. So if you want to get them to do something, you first tell them what you want, and then they get the reward. So I'm going to bring out my favorite little whiteboard. So here I want somebody to do a picture for me, and then they'll get the reward of the train. That's quite simple. You can make it as simple or complex as you want. They are often very reward driven. So if you give them a reward at the end of something, I try to see it not as bribery, but rather as a reward, that they're doing something. They've got this desire to please. They want to do the right thing, and they will just do what you ask them to do, because you've told them, first I want you to do this, and then I want you to do that. So this is one which is created with laminated pages, and this is for a child who would be regularly doing the same thing. So we might use something like this in a therapy session, where first we want them to sit in a group, in a circle, and do something, and then everybody can have their snack. So you can go with either approach, but it's really very, very valuable and can be used multiple times throughout a day. Okay, so somebody asked a question prior to tonight's session about a child constantly asking to see his nono, his favorite person, and they said he's asking 20 times in 10 minutes. Now, sometimes if he's just seen his nono, that might be the foremost thing in his mind. He keeps asking about it because that is what he is thinking about at that particular time. So if you show a visual schedule, which we discussed last week, in our last session, that shows what else he'll be doing during the day, and that gives him a sense of predictability. And sometimes it's called perseveration, where they keep asking the same question over and over again. It's because they're actually becoming a little bit anxious and they don't know what's happening next, so they keep asking the same thing over and over again. You could also have a weekly planner and show him that tomorrow after kinder, we're going to see nono. It's all about predictability, and the more you can show, the better off he will be. So some individuals want to do their first so that they can get their reward. But at times they might become hyper aroused and they may not actually be able to do that first thing because it's a little anxiety provoking. So I have a slide here. It's the second slide, which is called, it's a ready or not ready board. So sometimes we actually have to check in with them. How are you feeling? Are you feeling ready for the task or not ready? So the one on the left is a far simpler one where it's literally a yes or a no. The one on the right is a tick or a cross. And you might think, why are we doing this? They can just tell us if they're ready or not ready. But sometimes when they're feeling hyper aroused or anxious, they actually can't find their words at that moment. And it's easier for them just to point to a picture, either yes or no. So here I have what we use, a very simple ready, not ready board, where literally they just point to the color. You don't have to be able to read to use it. It's simple. You can use it at any age or stage. Another type of board that we sometimes use is a token board, we have a young man, he is a teenager, and he is obsessed with MasterChef. And Bev and I are going to talk quite a bit tonight about using their area of interest. So these are my tokens for his token board. And he knows that when he gets 3 tokens, first he has to earn 3 tokens, and then he can get his reward, whatever that may be. And we actually used this quite successfully during telehealth sessions, where he knew he had to get 3 or 4 or whatever it was for the day, tokens, and then he would actually get a 2-minute MasterChef. We chose different episodes and different parts that he really liked. And this token board, although it doesn't have cards with the area of interest, it's a kind of first then board. At the bottom, it's first I need to get my tokens, and then at the top it's showing the reward, so what the child will actually get when they have done their work. Another type of first then is actually using coins. So if we want them to do something first, like eating dinner, you might put 5 coins or 5 tokens on a table and say to them, you need to have 5 mouthfuls of dinner, and then you can have your ice cream. So this is visually showing them that they need to do something first to get their reward after. It's giving a finite end point by saying, we only want 5 mouthfuls. This is not a never-ending task. Once you've had 5 mouthfuls, you will get your reward. So it really plays into their need for predictability, and they know exactly what they will be getting. I'm going to hand over to Bev, who's going to discuss a little bit about reading and whole word reading now.
Thank you. So just before I get onto the reading, 2 things that came to mind. The first was, both with the structure of tonight as well as with the first then board, just reminding everyone that Fragile X learners are gestalt learners, and the word gestalt means whole. They prefer seeing the whole versus the parts. So by being able to see the whole and the end point, it helps them get an overview of everything, and that is very useful for them. So both examples we've shown tonight get a tick for that, of being able to see the whole before they begin. That young man that Bev referred to, I started off using the MasterChef tokens when we started telehealth sessions, because it was something so new and so different for him. As I heard her make reference to him, I thought, oh my goodness, I wonder when last I needed to use any sort of token system with him. He is now calm in my sessions. He is totally relaxed. He is literally putty in my hands in terms of compliance. And if ever there's been an example of hope, there it is. He was also one who tended to perseverate a lot. So he would say the same thing over and over and over and over. And I knew the minute he was doing that, he was either overexcited, over anxious, but I knew he was hyper aroused. And his window for learning was just not open when he was so aroused. So we needed to get his system calmer, and we'll discuss a few ways to do that today, before he could be more open to his learning. But one strategy we used was, he would tend to say these sort of random phrases that weren't meaningful, and he did have other language to use. So we actually had a visual of a rubbish bin, a council bin, and each session I'd have that page. And when I heard one of these things coming out, I'd say, you know, that didn't really mean anything, and it wasn't linked to what we're actually discussing. I think we need to write it on the rubbish bin, or near the rubbish bin, because it's sort of empty. It's just, we can throw it away. We don't need it. And today I marveled in his session. I think there was one reference to perseveration, but other than that, whereas previously he would perseverate for most of the session. So on to reading. Reading in Fragile X is an interesting one, because for me, certainly the majority of my Fragile X career, there's been this thing about Fragile X learners need to learn to read using whole word recognition. So for many of you, when you were at school, some schools implemented, depending on how old you are, the system of sight words and just learning to read via sight words. Today, we know the research indicates that a far more effective manner of learning to read is what we call synthetic phonics, or using phonological awareness skills. What that means is the ability to break words down into individual building blocks, and the individual building blocks are sounds, the sounds of words. And we break the words down, we sound out the word, we then put them together, and then we have the word. The reason why this was never encouraged for Fragile X learners is because we know they process information better when they see the whole, and it made perfect sense that they would therefore learn to read better with whole word recognition and using word memory for how words looked. Well, here's some of the problems with that. First of all, there's not much research. In fact, there's very little to ever point out, and the therapists in the audience tonight, I'm more than happy for you to email me and I can send you some references. Just because it's never really been tested whether the synthetic phonics approach is effective doesn't mean it isn't necessarily effective in this population. So I think people have always gone with the idea of, oh, well, the earlier clinical findings were that whole word recognition worked, so let's go with that. I don't believe that's the case anymore. And I definitely believe there is a role for synthetic phonics as well. How I use the whole word reading in individuals with Fragile X is I like to do it to decrease their anxiety with regards to reading. We know when eye contact is demanded, anxiety shoots through the roof in this population. I found that to be the case when, look at this word, read this word to me, read this word, and suddenly the gaze just goes away. We call it gaze aversion, and they can't even actually look at the page because the anxiety is so high. So I like to use high interest areas, whatever it might be. I follow their lead in the session. If they talk about an uncle's birthday, if they happen to see a kangaroo on a walk the night before, I use that as my topic to write some simple sentences, some very simple repetitive type sentences. I might just change one word each time, and I help them with predicting what that word is. Okay, it just boosts their confidence beautifully to use that whole word reading. But we know if they're ever to become a competent reader, they need synthetic phonics in order to decipher unfamiliar words, words that they've never seen before. So yes, they may have a bank of sight words that they've learned, but if ever we want them to be able to read novel words that they haven't seen before, they will need to use a synthetic phonic approach. Similarly, when I do this familiar reading and a predictable storyline with sentences that are very repetitive, I still encourage them, when unsure of a word, to look at the beginning sound. And by doing that, it's giving them a clue as to what that word might be. So it's a real combination that I like to use of a whole word approach, which, yes, helps boost their confidence and is important and could be a strength, because they have found that word recognition is actually an area of relative strength in Fragile X compared to their cognitive abilities. However, it's important to feed in the synthetic phonics as well, so that they are actually getting the best of both worlds. Yeah, that's it on reading. The next point we're going to touch on is closure. So closure means fill in the blank. Fill in the blank. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how we use closure well. Again, because they're Gestalt learners, they hate for something to be left unfinished. And using closure means giving that opportunity for them to fill in the blank, to pop in the last piece of the puzzle, to fill in the missing word. So I may ask somebody a question, and they may just sit and look at me like a deer in the headlights and not be able to formulate an answer. But if I start off the sentence for them, it's amazing to see how they'll finish it off. Okay. And really, the content of what I'm needing is what they're providing, not what I'm providing. I'm just starting them off and they're finishing it off. Sometimes it might be a single word. So, for example, if you are doing we call it a people play game. So, row, row, row your boat, and you're each sitting there and you're rowing merrily, 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 like this butter. And then you wait expectantly for them to fill in that last word and to say dream, or if it's the part of the crocodile, to do the scream. So that is what we call closure. A much more sophisticated example of closure was a secondary school client that I had who wasn't able, and I think I might have mentioned this last webinar, whenever they were doing his sect work novels that were being done, he wasn't able to write a full essay on that novel like the kids around him were. However, when we created a summary of the story and left out 10 words, with ease, he could fill in all of the 10 missing words and really show his knowledge. Okay. Other examples of closure are if a child is hitting out and is not able to express what it is, you could startle for them and you could say, you look like you're feeling upset. You're feeling upset because, and wait expectantly and see if they can fill in the rest of the sentence for you. So there's just a few examples of how we can use closure effectively. Over to you, Bev.
Okay, I'm going to discuss something which is totally different topic, but I think it's really important in the Fragile X world. All individuals with Fragile X have some sensory processing difficulties. And you may say, well, what is sensory processing? It's when the body is taking in information from the environment, processing the information, then linking it to past experiences so that they can actually respond to that information. And we have to be really careful because in Fragile X, there are a lot of sensory sensitivities. So just an auditory sensitivity was they can't cope with loud music. The air conditioning is going on in the classroom and it's making such a noise and they can't filter out the air conditioning. They can't hear the teacher talking. So these are just some really simple things that we need to think about. Now, when therapists with sensory integration training treat people with sensory processing difficulties, we can change the way in which the brain is wired and modify those sensitivities. But it's a sort of dual approach. While we can do that, we also need to look at the environment. And this is where the therapists and parents and teachers are so valuable. You need to start almost becoming detectives and looking at this environment and thinking, if he can't tolerate certain sounds, how is he managing the floorboards in the house? Because when we walk on the floorboards, they make a loud stomping noise. So we may need to put rugs down or carpets to avoid that echoey sound of floorboards. The same thing with the bathroom. A bathroom has tiles, it has no soft furnishings, and sometimes the flushing of a toilet can sound like a tornado. It sounds so loud and so unmanageable for them. So we have to think, is the flushing of the toilet causing them anxiety? Is it causing them some sense of distress? Maybe your individual with Fragile X needs to do their whole toileting routine, but go out of the toilet and somebody else needs to flush for them just to make life a little bit more pleasant for them. So here we have some noise cancelling headphones, and I have a lovely young girl whose family are absolutely footy crazy and they all want to go to the footy together when we were allowed to go to the footy in Victoria. So she would take along her noise cancelling headphones, and as soon as she felt things were getting a bit loud, she would put them on and keep them on until it was halftime or something. When the siren was finished going off, she would then take them off, have a bit of a chat to her family, and put them back on again. The other thing you can use are these earbuds or pods, which are coming with all the latest smartphones, and you can actually put music through them that they find pleasant and calming, or just use them in an environment to block out a bit of the sound. Other things that you might need to be aware of are, is your vacuum too loud? And that sound of the vacuum, I know it's a low frequency sound, but some people cannot tolerate it. Do you need to vacuum when your Fragile X individual is out the house just to make them feel more comfortable? Is your doorbell a pitch that they can't tolerate? Just simple things like this can make a big difference in terms of their sensitivities. For light sensitivity, they may prefer to wear sunnies even when inside. And lots of people with Fragile X like to wear a cap. Bev mentioned that gaze avoidance before, and this is something that they find particularly painful. They don't want to look at us, and if we force them to look at us, they're going to become highly anxious. They don't like being the center of attention. So wearing a cap sort of occludes those eyes a little bit, and they feel so much more comfortable and can do so many more things. If the lights at home are bothersome and they've got some visual sensitivity, you can try using yellow light instead of white light, have more diffuse type lights rather than down lights or spotlights. If they're bothered by touch, you'll probably know this because dressing is always an issue when they're bothered by touch. They may not wear or tolerate certain fabrics. They may not like lace, denim, stitching of buttons on the inside. And you may have to actually make some adaptations to their clothing. First, don't buy things if you know they don't like them. But I was talking to a young lady yesterday, and she said she got a beautiful lace top, which she really wanted to wear, but she couldn't tolerate the feel of the lace on her skin. So I said to her, how about you go and try it on and just put a singlet underneath so that you don't feel the lace? And she went, oh, wow, what a great idea. So sometimes we just need to think, how can we sort of create a bit of a barrier before we have that fabric? Do people really need to wear jeans? Can they get by in tracky pants? Things like socks, the seams might be irritating. To us, we can tolerate these things. We may feel the socks and the seams the first time we put them on, but then our body becomes used to it. With Fragile X and sensory processing disorders, they don't get used to it, and they're constantly feeling those socks so that that becomes their focus, and they can't think about whatever else is going on around them. I'm going to talk a bit about hyperarousal because I think this is really, really important. And this is something that every individual with Fragile X experiences. It's biologically driven, and it's when they can't cope with the environment because it's just all too much for them, or the social context is too difficult to navigate. So these individuals with Fragile X feel overstimulated. They may feel anxious, fearful, and they actually have something called a freeze, flight, or fright reaction. So if they freeze, that means they sort of become paralyzed. They cannot move, they cannot do anything, and they just stand there and look at you. If they have a fight reaction, you're going to know, because this often results in aggression. And if they have a flight response, they may run away and hide. So what we need to try and do is prevent the source of overstimulation and try and help them before they become hyperaroused, because once they're hyperaroused, it's difficult to manage the behaviors. And we need to think of what is causing that hyperarousal. You sometimes see something is going wrong and try and modify that environment or remove them from the environment if you can't change it. So it's just signs that somebody is becoming hyperaroused is that their behavior becomes disorganized. It may become frantic, and they may start engaging in those repetitive movements or that repetitive speech where they're saying the same thing over and over again, and they just cannot move on. They may become impulsive, aggressive, not cooperate, and they may attempt to leave the room. And don't try and stop them from leaving, because that may be their way of withdrawing from the situation so that they can actually manage and don't go into a totally hyperaroused state. We need to help them regulate at that stage. And I'm going to share with you one of the most valuable tools that I learned at my first Fragile X conference. And it's a really simple one. It's called the 5-finger approach. So you put up your hand and you say, stop, and you point to your thumb. Then you say, take a deep breath. And they need to take a deep breath in. You say, what is the problem? What do I need to do? And then do it. And between each one, give them time to process what you are saying and let them think about it and respond to you. And you need to practice this regularly so that when your individual with Fragile X hits an obstacle or becomes hyperaroused, you can use the strategy. It's not new for them, and they know how it all works. The other thing which is really valuable when they're starting to reach a state of increased arousal is the breathing cards. And I think they were shared after the last webinar that we did. Deep breathing is always a very valuable tool. It's something you can do at the drop of a hat. And we can use co-regulation where we sit with our Fragile X individual, just look at them, you don't need to talk, and just show them to breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. The other thing that's very calming is deep pressure. It helps to organize the nervous system. So just by giving someone a hug when they want deep pressure, make sure that they're not experiencing any tactile defensiveness at that point, because they probably won't want you coming into their personal bubble. So you could give them a big hug. You could just swaddle them a little bit, or put them in a large bean bag or in a corner of a comfy couch, just so they feel that deep pressure on their body, which is calming and organizing. You can also get lots of different weighted objects. They're weighted toys, weighted lap bags, and weighted blankets, which can be used and have an amazing calming effect. Some OTs can teach you the therapeutic brushing protocol, where there's a specific brush which gives deep pressure to the skin and the joints. Then Bev and I often refer to our sensory emergency backpack. And this is something that you take with you wherever you go. We always say go with an area of high interest. So if they love Thomas the Tank, go and get the Thomas the Tank backpack. If they are into Blue's Clues, get a Blue's Clues backpack. Something that they can take with them and something that you can pack all the essentials in that they may need in certain unmanageable or difficult to manage situations. So the first thing you can put in is some fidget toys. There are a whole variety of fidget toys that are commercially available. I always say simple stress balls like the star. Some of these fidgets are good for some and not for others. And you really need to play around and think what is going to work for some of the younger children. Things like those snakes may not be appropriate because they'll be putting them in their mouths. So just see what's going to work for your individual. Then you can also use Play-Doh or Therapatty, and then you could have something called TheraBand. And I have my piece of TheraBand here, and you just literally pull on the TheraBand and it gives a lot of deep pressure. And I'm feeling this through my arms and my shoulders as I'm pulling it. It's also good to have something that they find a favorite toy or a favorite object, a plush toy, which they can just put in that backpack and take it out and stroke that favorite toy. At the moment, I know those sequined cushions and toys are very much in vogue. Those are great. They give a lot of tactile input. Then we can also have some oral motor inputs, and these are things that you would put in your mouth. If you think of a young child or a toddler who sucks their thumb when they're feeling anxious or distressed, it's almost like giving them something to put in their mouth when they're anxious or distressed. A chewy necklace is a great option. Other non-food items like aquarium tubing, just a short piece of that is also good. Bubble gum. I know a lot of parents are opposed to bubble gum, but if you've come to our Fragile X clinic before, you will know that either myself, Bev, or Astra, the psychologist, may jump out with some bubble gum if we're seeing a child is feeling distressed. Often just by chewing and getting that heavy work through the jaw, a big piece of bubble gum just helps them to calm down, and it actually gets them to think about something else, not whatever is stressing them. When they come to our clinic, they're often in a new environment, they're with strange people, and there's just so much going on that it can be really tough. So when you take them to an unfamiliar place, just think about what impact this is having on them, and do we need a piece of bubble gum? We can also have other chewy things like licorice, fruit straps, pretzels, gum. Blowing toys are great because they encourage a lot of breathing, so bubbles and things like that. And then you could do sucking through a silly straw or a thick resistive straw. And I love the Camelback drink bottles because they have a really thick straw and you have to suck hard. So those are all options. Bev, I'm going to hand back to you to discuss modelling.
One other thing in terms of the sensory input, what can also often be either calming or alerting, depending on your child. And that's why it's important to work with an occupational therapist who can work out your child's individual profile, is either very spicy or very sour food. So some of those sour lollies sometimes can just give that, you know, that sort of alerting feeling for the child to help them really focus, especially if they're very fatigued, etc. So on to modeling. We know that imitation is a strength in individuals with Fragile X, and we like to use that and harness it as much as we can. So there's various forms of modeling. The one form is to purely provide a model for the child of the desired behavior. So for example, if the child wants the toy and goes and hits his brother for it, you could go and say, I really want this toy. can I have a turn? Providing that model, saying it slowly and really clearly, and lots of repetition for the child to be able to see, an opportunity for me to then use those words and imitate that behavior. Another form of modeling that we use is something called video modeling. So it's exactly what the name says, using videos for the child to watch what it is that is desirable versus undesirable behavior. So it could be learning a skill like getting dressed in the morning, and it may be dad who has to be the model and model first. We put on our undies, then we pull them up, then we put one leg in, then we put the other leg in, we pull them up, so that the child can watch the video and see from the beginning to the end the series of events. Another form of modeling we use is something called side modeling or side narration. Sitting opposite a child with Fragile X is sometimes anxiety provoking when we tell them, now watch me, I'll do it, and then you, no, that's just going to shoot their anxiety up. So sometimes we just sit next to them and we, go on our own merry way, and they may not be prepared to do what we're doing at the time, but we can just speak it through. So for example, if I'm writing my name, I could go, or the child's name. So I'm going to pick up my pencil, and now you can hear I'm using a very calming voice. I'm going to do a long line down, and then I'm going to do 2 round paths. Oh, look at that, I've made a B. And what you're doing is you just start directing it at the child and making them feel like they're in the spotlight. Because when anxious, if the anxiety is too high, they cannot use the smarter part of their brain if emotionally that part of the brain is just making them flip their lid. We sometimes recommend, not sometimes, often recommend, because of the modeling that's provided at school by higher functioning kids, we really like the idea of either being in a mainstream school setting so that the other children can be the models, or at least what we call a split placement. So perhaps 2 to 3 days in a specialist school setting and another couple of days in a mainstream setting, just so that they are getting some really good modeling. There are also some commercially available social skill videos for high functioning individuals or adolescents. There's one called Everyday Speech social skill videos, which are really great, and it really shows them what the people might be thinking, what they might be saying, and it also shows the inappropriate behavior and then a video model of what would be a better way to try and conduct themselves. So video modeling is great. We had a young lady, which wasn't a young lady, she was probably in her mid-30s, who had a real fascination with the Wiggles. And what we suggested was creating a video to Wiggles music, using the Wiggles songs even, but of her performing different actions that were desirable. So for example, if it was paying at a store and then walking out, instead of remaining in the store, this could be done with a Wiggles item, with Wiggles music playing in the background. So it's really individualized and tailored to her high interest areas. The minute you're using high interest areas, you've got such a wider window of learning happening. Bev?
I'm going to just follow on from that and say that when we are teaching new skills, as Bev said, it is so valuable to use modeling, side modeling, video modeling, just pure narration on the side. And we often teach with Fragile X by means of backwards training. So when children are traditionally taught, things are done in a sequential manner. First you do this, then this, then this, then this. With Fragile X, that's not a great thing for them. As Bev has said before, they are gestalt learners. They like to see the whole picture and they want to see the whole task. So if we're using, say, backwards training, which is very successful with dressing skills, we would look at the task of putting on shoes. So this shows somebody doing all the steps of putting on their shoes. And this is called a visual task schedule. So it just shows one particular task, but it's broken down into very specific steps. if you were the parent or the caregiver or whatever, you would help them and do the first 4 steps of this, and then expect them to pull the Velcro and stick it closed. Once they've mastered that last part, which gives them the completion they always desire, and they're achieving success and making you happy, which is what Fragile X individuals generally like to do, they'll be ready to move back to the number 4 step. So then you can let them do steps number 4 and 5. Once they've got number 4 and they're pulling out the back, then you can move on to step 3. And in this way, you work from the end backwards to the beginning, but they're always getting that sense of closure and achievement, and they're always completing the task, which makes them feel fantastic.
And the last one we're going to talk about tonight is just the importance of team communication. These individuals often have a very large team of both family members, carers, and professionals involved. And it's important for everybody to be on the same page, okay? Be realistic in terms of the communication, perhaps from school, as much as you'd love a 4-page written journal each day as to exactly what your child was able to do and not able to do. That's not realistic for a teacher who may have other children in the class with additional needs as well, not to mention all the other typically developing kids in her class too. So as something like asking the teacher to send 3 or 4 photos home, not only is that something visual for your child to look at, but it's a means of communication for you as to what was worked on that day, what you can discuss with your child, and seeing what progress was made, or maybe a particular way in which something was set up. So as long as there is constant communication between everybody on the team meetings are really important, WhatsApp groups are really good. Yeah, it's important to have everybody in the know and in the loop. So I'll just finish off with that slide that I started off with, which was the 7 points that we spoke about. But just before that, the overall message that we'd love to give tonight is the miracles do happen. The miracles absolutely do happen. They don't necessarily happen quickly. And there's a lovely expression from a program called the Feuerstein Instrumental Enrichment Program that says, just a minute, let me think, okay? Give them time. They may not develop a skill in the time frame you had expected them to do it, but reach for the stars, the sky's the limit, and always assume that there will be achievement. It just may not happen in the time frame that you're hoping. We've had parents say, will my child ever speak? Especially little ones who may be taking a few years to find their words. The good news and the hope is that I think in all my years, I've maybe met 1 or 2 individuals only that were actually nonverbal. And if anything, it's the other extreme where parents initially say, will he ever speak? And then they come to us and say, will he ever shut up? Because they just cannot believe how much language there is and how much talking there is. I have a 22-year-old client who only in the last year has his language absolutely exploded. In fact, I got a text from his mum just before this session started tonight saying it's incredible to hear the changes that have happened in his language. Yeah, and a lot of that has been as a result of giving him an alternative means of communication, not to rely on, but to boost his oral means of communication. So lots of hope, lots of flexibility is needed though. So, you know, as the therapist or as the parent, you may think, he's not doing it this way. You know, I want him to do X, he's doing Y. By following his lead, by having lots of flexibility, going with the high interest areas, what's of interest to him, not necessarily what's of interest to you, okay? This just helps all this beautiful growth happen. And yeah, very, very exciting population for us to be involved in. So just to finish off, I will share my screen again with that slide. We touched on some strategies like a first then visual, some ideas to help with reading, the idea of closure, filling in the missing bits, sensory sensitivities, and working through the sensory system to help with calming, various forms of modeling, whether it be physically demonstrating or video modeling or side modeling, where you're just speaking and they're taking it in without being instructed to actually do something themselves, backward chaining, where you get them to do the last part and then the second last and the last part, and finally, the importance of team communication.
Bev Sher and Bev Kadish, thank you both so much for such a wonderful presentation. I'm sure that we could all listen to you for so much longer, and I feel that you've shared so much more than a spoonful of hope. It's a bucket, to be honest, and we really appreciate everything that you do within the Fragile X community and the many families and individuals that you work with. And we hope that we'll have the opportunity to have you on board to do another webinar in the future. I can see lots of thank yous coming through on the chat, and people have obviously really enjoyed and learned so much. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.